Welcome to the Mindful Soul Center podcast. I'm Amy Adams. In today's episode, I will be sharing an interview that I had with Kathleen Joan of Bridgid's Flame. Kathleen Joan is a spiritual teacher and is interested in exploring the theme of the divine feminine as a pathway to creating balance in our sometimes topsy-turvy world. She holds master's degrees in both theology and ministry. At one point, the walls came tumbling down around the foundations of her faith that was based in patriarchy. Later, she reconnected and deepened her relationship with the divine as the Mother Goddess. She is a Reiki master and spiritual teacher dedicated to helping others discover the goddess within. Our conversation was really, I just loved it. And I'm not going to tell you about it because here, just listen. So, can you tell us a little bit about your business and how you got started and exactly what do you do?
Thanks so much for having me on the podcast. Bridgid's Flame. Bridgid is both a Catholic saint and a pagan goddess. And you were actually kind of asking me earlier, how I chose Bridgid. And what I would actually say is she somewhat chose me in the sense that when I heard her story, I didn't grow up knowing about her. I'd never heard of Saint Brigid pretty much. But when I discovered, I grew up Catholic, but when I discovered Bridgid in my 30s, I was teaching religion at a Catholic high school. I had done the whole, master's degree in religion. And here I am, teaching about spirituality and things like this, right? But from that Catholic background, I had volunteered with nuns, I did the whole, really dove into the Catholic faith thing. And I discovered Bridgid and I heard about her story about how, essentially, so Bridgid was an ancient goddess, a Celtic goddess, right? Before Ireland was Christianized. And then when Ireland became Christian, they kind of kept her, but they turned her into a saint. So and all the aspects and attributes of the goddess just got sort of transferred onto this person who was actually a historical woman named Saint Brigid. So there was actually a person in the 5th century, so right as Ireland is becoming Christian, who founded a women's religious order. She was the abbess of this monastery at Kildare. Her name was Saint Brigid, and she kept burning in her convent the fire. There was a perpetual fire that was always lit to the pagan goddess. And the priestesses of Bridgid, the goddess, would tend the fire, right? Because Bridgid is a goddess of fire and of the sun, and of the forge and all these other things, right? But so Saint Brigid kept that fire perpetually burning in her Catholic women's monastery for hundreds of years. And that you can actually go today to Kildare, Ireland, and the Brigidine sisters have this little candle in their spirituality center there that is still the flame of Bridgid that's burning there, right? So when I heard that story, it really struck me as sort of this crossroads of the divine feminine and the Catholic faith that I feel like I'm part of and that I'm familiar with. I have an Irish Catholic background, and so Bridgid to me was this way of putting those things together, and she embodies both kind of holding both ends, the divine feminine and the religion that I've grown up with that a lot of people know, right, which is Christianity. And she's both. So that's really why she called to me. Yeah.
Are you still teaching in a school or anything?
I'm not. That, a lot of things shifted for me during the pandemic, and that's why I ended up leaving that job teaching at that high school. But part of it was that I found out that the divine feminine needed to be front and center in my work, and that wasn't going to happen as much as I wanted it to in a Catholic setting, Catholic high school setting. So it was time to take the next step professionally. Yeah.
Yeah. So I know that you have circle, women's circles, or anyone who identifies as female, right?
Yes.
So what do you do with that? How does Bridgid relate to that?
Bridgid is present. Well, she's funny because she's the goddess of the sun, right, and of fire, but she's also a goddess of water and of the moon. Like Bridgid is kind of like everything, right? So my my circle, which is called Bridgid's Well, is named after it's like in the ancient Ireland, right? Like the well, Bridget's Well, you can actually still go to sacred places that are wells of Bridgid, right? In Ireland. And that was a place where people would go to connect with the divine feminine, with the goddess, and literally to draw water, to be sustained and nourished and refreshed, right? So it's from the earth and it's from the goddess. So the name Bridget's Well, of my women's circle refers to that, right? It's a place where we come together online for the different phases of the moon. And we refresh our spirits from the goddess, and we have a different divine feminine theme that we talk about, and we're together as women in circle. And that's, to me, that's where the divine feminine rises up, right? Where we take that time to connect with one another and to invite her in, to our awareness, because she's been so pushed to the side by patriarchy for centuries, right? So just bringing back that divine feminine awareness, to me, that's like we do it in this little women's circle. And to me, it's also something that needs to happen on a global scale, right? In order for us to really rebalance our relationship with like the earth and with one another and the climate crisis and everything, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Big issues. So
Yeah, exactly.
like,
Goddess is like everything, right?
I think a lot of people agree that the divine feminine is missing in general. But then there'll be some people that say, well, we're not missing the divine feminine. Like, what's wrong with the way things are?
Mhm.
What would you say to somebody who would say to you, well, I think everything's fine the way it is?
Yeah, I mean so many things, right? Because that's kind of the mentality that most of us, I think, in patriarchal society, we grow up by default thinking of God as male, right? So we're taught that, and we just think about that. And so to call God she, or to talk about the goddess, feels really different. It can feel really scary. It could feel like, wait a minute, that's not God, right? That's not like, I think it is so ingrained in us from the way that we're raised, and even if we're not like raised specifically religious, just from being in a patriarchal context and society, right? We tend to think of God as an old white man sitting up on a cloud, right? And when we start to look into it, what I would say to that person is, when we start to look into our images of God, right? How we think of the divine, we discover that we name God and we imagine God in the ways that we value, or the things that we value and that we hold as sacred are what we associate with God, right? So if God is an old white man sitting up on a cloud, then old, white, male, and powerful, and sort of elevated, like higher up, which comes back to like sort of our minds over our bodies, right? All this kind of thing. Then those qualities and those people who represent those qualities, we see them as valuable. We see them as sacred. We see power as just and right and good when it is wielded by the people who look like quote unquote God, right? So it really functions to uphold all these really harmful dynamics in our society. Like if we only think of God as male, we're going to think, oh, that's sacred, that's wonderful, that's good. Oh, the female is less. The female is not equal, is not sacred, is not holy, right? And like this has been such a messed up dynamic in like the history of patriarchal religions, right? Because it teaches us that like, okay, the men have the power, the men do the sacred things. For like the sort of glaring example that I was raised with is that the Roman Catholic Church still doesn't ordain women. So like only the men are up there doing the priestly rituals, right? What happened to the sacred priestesses of the feminine? What happened to the feminine women being associated as sacred, right? So we start to lose this. We split things, right, into like here's what's holy, sacred, good, valuable. Everything else is ew, is dirty, is less. Like, by the way, these priests, the Catholic celibate priests, don't even marry women, right? And there's this like sort of total dissociation of the divine from women, from the feminine. Same thing can happen with race, by the way, right? Like if God is imagined or Jesus is imagined as white, right, which is not historically accurate, it functions to uphold white supremacy and racism, these kinds of things, right? So I would say like if we look at our society and we look at where people are hurting, it's often because our association with the sacred has been devalued. People don't look at us and see the holy sacred image of the divine, right? That's pretty much everybody who's not an old, powerful, white male, heterosexual, right? Like all of these things, it has to do with our images of the divine.
There's two things that I wanted to touch upon, and one myself personally is I found myself, which I don't like this, but it's true. So I don't like this about myself, but it's true. But I find, and I think a lot of people default to this too, even in media, maybe a little bit less on YouTube, but because there's a wider range of people, because it's just anybody is out there doing it. I find myself respecting, and I don't think this is just me, looking towards people for answers when there are women who have the same answers. I mean, maybe I don't know about them as much, some, I mean, so that's part of it is because it's harder to find women who,
Right.
maybe represent, that are, superstars in their domain. But yeah, I don't know. I find that that's one thing that I've noticed. It's not just me. I know that. I know it's a lot of people do this. And it's something, though, that I notice about myself that I don't like, because I'd like to value and respect an expert opinion, or that I just feel like it's not even, first of all, not even as accessible.
Mm-hmm.
And but then I found even that, like, why am I choosing that? It's not even
Mm.
conscious. I'm not doing it consciously.
Right, right.
Automatically, it's like my conditioning, and I
Yeah.
want to break it, but it's very hard.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great point though about where do we go for our sources of information or truth, whose authority do we rely on, right? Which is a divine feminine issue. Like, do we go to women or female identified people as experts or as, resources? Do we trust ourselves? Do we trust other women, right? To be reliable sources of truth and information and juicy, wonderful resources that we can use in our lives, right? So yeah, I think you're onto something. I think there's some really deep programming there, right?
Yeah.
And like you said, like, yeah, we haven't had as much of a platform and a microphone, so sometimes we're harder to find. But I think that's where we network with each other, and that's what's so powerful, I think, about Mindful Soul Center and that opportunity for women, helping women and other people, right? But to like find all of these resources and reach one another.
Yeah. So I then the other thing too, though, that I wanted to talk about, kind of as the God, as because we're personifying like this ineffable, the ineffable. That's what
Mhm.
I consider. For me, God is the ineffable. It's
Yeah.
like, it's just that we're just, I mean, not because even recently with the NASA and the other, Europe and Canada, whatever, joined together to do the
Mm.
James Webb Telescope. And it's just a reminder now, when we're seeing again, like, 5 galaxies in one picture,
Yes.
recognizing how tiny we are. And
Yeah.
I mean, we're already tiny on the earth if we think of ourselves individually.
Right, right.
Think about, there's just 5 galaxies like next to each, and that's only a few of them. There's and everything. So, I mean, I think it serves us to personify God, but I wonder, like, is there another way we can make God more relatable,
Hmm.
without necessarily making it into a person?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of people resonate with that. I think many people, like even when I was teaching at the Catholic high school, a lot of the students would prefer to say like the universe or the transcendent or the divine. Like they were very like spiritual but not religious, which I think is very Gen Z as well, right? Like the younger generation. Um, yeah, and a lot of people kind of find their spirituality in like nature or relating to like the natural universe, like you said. Um, so yeah, I think that's a totally valid path because we come into contact with like, oh, this is what's greater than me. This is something that's beyond me, and it reminds us of that we're related to a universe that is so much bigger than we can imagine, right? And where does all that come from, and sacred source, and how is sacred source embodied in all of it. So I think there's so much rich exploration there. I do think that it's important to personify God in a lot of very diverse human ways, precisely because there are aspects of ourselves that have been so denigrated and like put down. And, we've gosh, done all sorts of things to to women and to people of color and to LGBTQ community, and like all of these things that need to be restored to their rightful place of sacredness, right? In our society. And so to me, at least, and maybe this is because I'm from a more traditionally religious background, but when we start saying, God, we could say, God is a trans person, God is a woman, God is this, that, right? It starts to it jolts us out of our our ways of thinking, and it starts to help us think, oh well, what if we fully brought back all these aspects of ourselves as humans and as a society that have been pushed to the side, right? So I think that's where the personifying of God is really helpful.
Well, and I'm actually, because I was wondering too, well, because then I think also there is in the traditions a lot of backlash when this concept comes
Right.
up, because it's like, no, this is
Mm-hmm.
how it is. And we're not judging.
Mm-hmm.
So across many religions, not just um, one or two, which kind of brings me back to this idea though, because of the backlash. And I'm wondering, like, Bridgid, was there, I mean, historically, because I don't really know much about, I mean, I know some little general things about her, but like, was there like backlash for her? I mean, her community, was it like a community of nuns? And um, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about.
Yeah, there's some really thanks, because there's some really interesting historical facts that we know around that. So the one thing that was unusual was that Bridgid's monastery was a double monastery, so there were men and women there, which was not typically the case, right? You would usually have a men's or women's religious order, and she was the abbess that was in charge of all of it. So right there we have sort of a feminist a model of leadership, right? She was a leader not only of her order of nuns, but also the men who were there, right? And everyone was kind of forming this newly Christianized Irish spiritual community, in that. So it was sort of a moment of birthing something new, right? In that way, combining Christianity with kind of their traditional religion. And the interesting story is that there was a Catholic bishop who in charge of the area, who would have been a man, right, like an ordained bishop, who wanted to bless Bridgid and say the prayer for her to make her the abbess over her whole monastery, right? Okay, wonderful. So he's saying this prayer. Somehow, the way the historical account goes is he accidentally, quote unquote, accidentally, said the prayer to make her a bishop. And he was kind of like, whoops, well, I guess it's done now. No takebacks. Like, like you can't unmake her a bishop once he said the prayer. I believe that man absolutely knew what he was doing, right? Recognizing her as the spiritual elder and leader for her whole region, which is what a bishop is, right? So it's funny that you ask about backlash. I'm not aware that anyone was kind of like against that. Maybe because she was just so well known, and people went to her for spiritual guidance and all of this in her area. But yeah, I'm actually not aware of any, and in rather, kind of there was this bishop that like, whoops, accidentally said the wrong prayer.
I did go to an all girls Catholic high
Hmm.
school. I also found there were nuns who were very traditional. A couple of them, actually, less of them were very traditional,
Hmm.
and the other ones were super progressive.
Oh yeah. Hmm.
I mean, we had social justice was one of our religious studies
Yeah.
courses. Really, it was really pretty amazing, and a lot. We had Buddhism, we had
That's
meditation,
awesome. Yeah.
like these like semester options, and
Hmm.
also the time I think I was a child of the late 70s and
Hmm.
to the early 80s, so I think the culture was really coming through, and nuns didn't wear habits there,
Right. Right.
which was something that was a change,
Hmm.
in a really
Yeah.
thing.
No, there are so many really progressive, actually, like um, religious, like men and women, but particularly the ones I've worked with have been the women who have been really progressive and like done all this amazing work kind of within the existing structures, right, of the Catholic Church. And yeah, I mean that reminds me of Bridgid, right? Just to be like, okay, well here's the structure that we're in, but we're going to keep the light of the goddess burning.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just because the story, Bridget, actually made me think about those nuns. I hadn't really given
Mhm.
them much thought lately. But
Right.
I do really recognize that actually through my whole adult life, I really feel like I was so grateful to actually, because I wasn't really thrilled about going to, you want to go to the school with all your friends in the neighborhood or what,
Right. Sure. Sure.
when
Yeah.
you're a teenager. So, but, reflecting back, I really feel grateful. And, of course, I had many beautiful friendships and all that great stuff with other people.
Hmm.
But, it's like all girls, so
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
that was
That
the
was.
case. So,
I was like, yeah, having taught high school for 9 years, I can probably tell you you weren't missing much at that age.
yeah, I know,
But
but it's interesting too because I know there have been studies too where like boys are called upon more and girls don't have the same opportunities.
yes.
So we
Hmm.
had like the mock UN and all these different things and different societies.
Yeah, yeah. And it was all the girls doing it. With those opportunities for leadership, right? Those opportunities to develop your skills and to not feel socially kind of like a stigma around standing up and being in your leadership, right?
And even at 16 or 17 years old, not worrying what you look like.
Yeah,
And not,
exactly.
this notion, I mean, that the uniforms were ugly, but, they did the job.
But everybody's wearing it. Everybody has the same thing.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, um, now, once you kind of like connected with Bridgid, then how did you? I mean, because I get the kind of like, all right, she really is the embodiment of this kind of divine feminine aspect. But then, what made you decide to? I mean, I know you said that we need more of the thing, but like, um, how did you imagine that would even happen? Like,
That's a great question. Um, and I'm laughing because, yeah, that was one of those moments when the goddess's imagination is definitely bigger than mine. Like, I never thought I would start my own business. That was just never a thing. Like, I knew other people did it. I had no interest. I was like, I've never took a business course in my life. I was an English major, like, so it was just not a thing. But what I ended up sort of discovering was that as I became more passionate and more called to speak about divine feminine, there's just limits to what you can do, even in a pretty progressive Catholic school setting, right? Which is where I was. And so it's like if there's no institutional support if there's no like institution that I'm aware of that will pay me goddess, salary and benefits to do goddess ministry, then what? Then I need to start my own ministry, right? So that was kind of my next step, where it was like it was a leap of faith for sure, right? Um, but I had trained to lead women's circles, new moon circles, through this group called the Wild Women Project, which is a global network of women's circles. And I did their training while I was, I was still teaching, whatever, but I did their moon circle leadership training. I was like, whoa, this is like running retreats, which I do with the Catholic school, but with the goddess. Like, it's like, wow, it's not that different, right? But I was able to bring in, and I am able to make it about the divine feminine, right? Um, so that was kind of how it got started. Was I started having sort of these realizations of, hey, I can do very similar work to what I'm already doing, um, but really being authentic. Like I think there was this question of authenticity and bringing forth, who I really am and what I'm called to do and how I'm called to minister, and I can do that authentically, and I can create structures in my life and in my business that will allow that to be sustainable. That was a long, that was a big leap of faith, and then it's still a process, right, of building that. But yeah.
becoming your authentic self. This is something that has just been a huge topic that's been coming up. I mean, really, I think it's probably always been something that's been discussed, but maybe because of YouTube and the way the internet has changed the world and can really connected us, I think a lot of people talk about like, are you being your authentic self? Are you showing who you are? And I think my question is like, what would you say to somebody like as an encouragement to embrace their authentic self, or maybe not even an encouragement? I'm not sure if that's the right word, but like, what do you think that means?
What comes up for me when you say that is like the divine spark that's within us, right? Like, I mean, I personally believe that like we're all sort of a very little, like a little flame of the big goddess flame, if you will, right? And that that's sort of the essence of who we are, is this little divine spark that's within us. It's our you might call it our consciousness or our soul or our, you know, our heart, but like sort of what we sense to be the authentic core of who we are. Like, I believe that that's a little piece of the divine, right? Um, and so my perspective on that is it's kind of like the saying that like nobody else can be you for you. Like the divine wants to express themselves, I could say, right, in all of these diverse ways. That was actually something that I learned, a beautiful statement I still remember from a classmate in grad school in my master's program, in degree in theology, right? Who was a trans woman, a Black trans woman who talked about like sort of discovering her identity as a trans woman, and the what was it, like the extravagance of God, like not just generosity, like the total extravagance of God to express the divine self in all of the infinite ways, like as many ways that are possible. Right? It's like the divine is not content with just the little box of like what society says that we should be, right? The divine wants like this expression over here too, and also that one. If you almost like if you think of all the plants that are in nature or all the animals that are in nature, right? Like God wasn't okay with just horses and dogs. She wanted a platypus too, like, and dinosaurs. Like like she wants like everything that can possibly be to be created. And so each bit of that is a sacred, unique expression of the divine. If we don't do our little piece, no one else is going to, right? Like we're each created to be this unique, beautiful expression of who the divine is, in my opinion. So yeah, that's what I would say about that. Is like I just got to a point where I was like, oh, mine really includes divine feminine. Like I need to talk about the goddess and do ritual and worship with her, and that just wasn't going to fly so much in the Catholic school setting. So it was like, okay, this is the little flame that I need to
Yeah,
express.
I think,
Right?
well, because I'm even speaking personally, like I have always had these different ideas of what I wanted to do, and when I was younger, you know, I I didn't do some of the things I wanted to do. I didn't even think it was possible.
Mhm.
And so
Yeah, our imaginations get so boxed in by, well, just kind of we're limited beings, and what society tells us is possible, right? So then, yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
and so, well, because I remember this person, that one of my brother's friends uh was, I hung out with them all the time, and so I was very close with them, and I remember being out, and I remember saying something, and I was probably like 20 at the time, and saying something like, "Oh, I really want to do art." And then it was like, "Well, why don't you just do art?" You know what I mean? Like, and honestly,
Right.
it's that one little thing like changed my life, even though didn't end up going to college for art until later. Later, I was
Uh,
actually was doing something else. I was doing architecture or whatever, but um yeah, it was just weird because it was like, yeah, you can do that. Like, you there, like, why don't you just do it? But it was a guy who told me that. You know what I mean? Like,
mhm,
I think all the girls and the women were like, we were all getting, and maybe it's generational too, the time of when I was growing up, but
mhm,
it's kind of, and my mom and my dad, they both worked. It wasn't like there
mhm.
I didn't have like a traditional stay out. It wasn't like the 1950s, somebody
Right.
was like baking and the kind of stereotypical thing. So I did have like see this kind of thing, but I don't know. And just I was like, okay, I'm gonna grow up, I'm gonna meet somebody, I'm gonna get married. I mean, I still was gonna
Right.
get educated and all that other stuff, but it was, I felt like there was less of a focus on the importance of my education, even though my parents were like, "Oh, you do whatever you want, you're so smart and whatever, blah blah,"
Right.
but there was still
Mhm.
underneath it all. like not the, and then also art wasn't practical, well, it's probably still not.
Right, right.
But that doesn't matter, right? I mean, because a lot of people have degrees in things that aren't necessarily practical. So,
Sure, yeah.
and so no, so I was just, so I've often just thought about, I love that it's actually such a good thing now that people are really talking about it, because it's like
Hmm.
being, finding your essence, finding what it is, and being true to your purpose, and your, like, even just being, having integrity of who you are, and instead of
Hmm.
being
Yeah.
like following what other people's expectations are, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that story you shared, I mean, to me sounds like a powerful example of why we need the divine feminine. Like it sounds like, you're like, oh, well, because was that gender based for you? It was like, oh, because
I
I'm a woman.
I believe so. Yeah. Outwardly, I don't think my parents intentionally. I don't
Right.
think it was like a conscious thing. I just realize it now. Like there really was less importance placed on.
Yeah. Sometimes it's so subtle, right? That we're not even conscious of it. But you're an art goddess. You're a creatress, and the world needs your art, right?
Yeah. It took me years
Yeah.
though to get. I mean, I ended up getting a master's in fine arts ultimately, and painting, everything, but
Hmm.
yeah, it's just really the authentic self. I feel like that is something that, and there's also personal fear, I think, even stepping into your authentic self. People are like, who am I?
Yes.
It doesn't need, for me, like that question, like, because sometimes you're like, oh, like the big deep questions, like, who am I don't care who I am in relation to like the vast universe, because I'm not going to understand that, like, physical human body. I mean, I'm interested in
Right.
those topics and I want to have intelligent discussions about them, but
Sure.
for me, I feel like, who am I? It's like, what can I do on this earth is more like, what
Hmm.
what is it that I can give to, like, what is going to be my legacy? What is going to be my thing? Like,
Right.
how can I help other people? Or, and you can help people from like the most mundane, like some people might consider something like a mundane task, even though it's not,
Hmm.
to something extremely, like going to the space station or whatever and being there. So,
Yeah,
like, it
exactly.
doesn't really matter what you're doing. It's like, is it the thing for you? Is it like
Yeah.
your in your inherent nature? Is it like, are you going to look back and worry that you didn't have the courage to do that or something? So
Right, exactly. Yeah, and right, it's that like that thing that like you said is authentic, that sort of clicks in and makes you like light up, right? Like I when I was considering sort of making the job move of leaving the Catholic school, starting my own ministry and stuff, I talked to a colleague who was also a dear friend about it, and colleague in the religion department who like really understood these things, and I started crying. And she goes, okay, so I don't see you cry about like leading the sophomore retreat at the high school, but I do see this deep connection you have with the divine feminine. I'm like, yes, she's, it's the goddess, right? So it was just this thing that like, yeah, that's there's something deep within us that calls us to serve and love in a particular way, right? And I'm glad that for you, you got to pursue that through art and not through a lot of different things as well. But yeah.
but I'm curious, like, your parents, are they, because you were raised in a traditional Catholic
Uh-huh.
home, how did they feel about you kind of embracing the divine feminine and Bridgid?
Yeah, my parents are pretty progressive Catholics, and so I was always raised with this sort of like social justice orientation to Catholicism, and you know, less of the sort of like really dogmatic perspective, right, and more of the like let's help everybody in the world to like flourish and be who they are called to be in the image of God in their unique way, right? So yeah, and my parents were aware that I'd already been part of a goddess community in San Francisco for several years before I started this ministry. Um, I found this great place that is called Her Church. The official name is Ebenezer Lutheran, but it's the nickname is Her Church, and it's a Lutheran church that has converted all of their names and images for the divine to feminine. And when I walked in there, it was like, what is this? Like, it was another one of those, wait, you mean this exists? Like, it's the whole church is painted purple on the outside. It's all this divine feminine art, everything. I was like, it was just one of those moments of, I never would have thought this was a thing, like that this existed at all. It kind of reminds me of what you said earlier about the telescope pictures of the universe, like there's so much out there that we're not familiar with.
Yeah.
Right? And it may sound, like such a small example, but it's like you discover something that you never would have entered your mind, except I will say, put a star on that. I had been calling God she in my private journals since college. I just didn't know anyone else who did that. Right. So it's like I was able to connect with other people who were kind of drawn towards the same thing. Anyway, my parents knew about the whole like I was in a goddess band. Like there was this whole, they knew about the whole goddess thing. And when I, shifted into doing my own ministry with a divine feminine focus, they were like, okay, that's great.
Yeah. It's nice because I know there's, kind of extreme, because even one parent could be like, hey, that's cool. And the other one is like, well, I think
Yeah.
boundaries, whatever. So,
Right.
just,
Well, both of my parents attended her church. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that my father won't mind me sharing this story. Because when he came, my mother came for the first time, loved it, right? It was like, oh, this divine feminine, this is great. My dad came for the first time, and his reaction afterwards was he said, this makes me realize how little I know about God. And I about cried because it was like,
right now.
I know, how little do I know, how little I understand, right, about that, because there's so many different ways that we can understand the universe and the sacred and the God. And it's like when we've only been taught one way, and this is why I think it's really important to personify God in different ways that we haven't been taught, right? Because all of a sudden, so much opens up for us spiritually, emotionally, psychologically. We're like, wait, you mean there's this whole new horizon, right? Of like understanding the sacred, which is also understanding ourselves,
Yeah.
So
that's beautiful.
yeah.
Go Dad.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that is so cool. So you offer now, since you have like a ministry, can you explain a little bit more to like, because like anybody who would be listening for me, even there
Mhm.
are people who are priestesses of this or that, or of Isis, or Bridgid, or
Mhm.
whomever. But like through the training, or I mean, because you have the master's degree, so
Mhm.
like how did that come to be? That's so I mean,
Like what's the actual ministry
somebody
that
wanted
I'm
one
engaging?
too, like how would they do that? So,
Yeah. So, yeah, I do have. So I offer for all genders. I'll say first of all, because we've been talking primarily about divine feminine, but I do offer spiritual direction. So that's one-on-one spiritual accompaniment, conversation about your life and your spiritual journey, and we listen for how spirit is speaking to you in whatever ways and whatever forms. So I am trained to do that in a one-on-one conversation setting, and that's it's all Zoom at the moment, right? So yeah, I offer that for all genders. I also am a Reiki energy healer. That's another thing that emerged while I was at the Goddess Church in San Francisco. Was like, wait, energy healing's a thing. So now I am a Reiki energy healer, which I love. For the record, there are people who say that Jesus practiced Reiki. I don't know, or energy healing. Who am I to say he didn't, right? But Reiki is a wonderful form of mental, emotional, physical healing through energy that I work with individuals one on one of any gender. And then I have my women's circle. So New Moon Goddess Circle happens on every new moon, and that's public. And anyone who's female identified, if you identify as a woman, you are warmly welcome to this circle, and anyone can drop in, and there's a sliding scale fee for that, but it's pretty affordable. So any women can drop in at the new moon and be part of our circles. And for those who want to go deeper, there's Bridgid's Well, which is the monthly membership where we meet at the full moon as well, and the waxing moon, the waning moon, and we have different rituals and different activities around each phase of the moon. So that's how she's working at the moment. She, the goddess, right? How she's moving at the moment, and who can say what will be next? But that's.
is there something that you would like to offer the audience, like as a gift?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a free guide that is posted on my website that anyone can download called 5 Ways to Connect with the Sacred Feminine Daily. And that just contains some simple spiritual practices that anybody can do, like in your home, to just start bringing in some of that divine feminine energy, right, to your life. And so anyone can download that. It's free. It's at brigidsflame.org. And you can just start kind of exploring, like, what are some of the ways that you would like to call in divine feminine, sacred feminine? What does that mean to you? How is that a part of your own journey and your understanding of who you are?
All right. Well, thank you for joining me.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Amy. It's been a pleasure.
Well, that concludes our episode with Kathleen Joan of Bridgid's Flame. You can check out her website, brigidsflame.org. And please leave a review if you enjoyed this episode. You can leave some stars on Spotify, or you can leave us an Apple review, even though I don't know how to do that for myself. It never lets me. So, until next time. Music in this episode includes Lone Cannon by Pazu and Enchanted by Cody